Sheriff Hadley, this way.
I can't keep coming down here every time you guys have one of your crazy theories.
But it's different this time. You got something.
We want to make a case to remove the ban on the book.
What book?
To Kill a Mockingbird.
I told you before that I don't.
Well, just listen to what we have to say, because this book has great lessons about prejudice, courage, and innocence.
The theme of prejudice is there throughout the book, and just like Scout, kids today could learn from Scout's experiences with prejudice.
And what experiences are those?
Throughout the book, we see the theme of prejudice. In fact, the first time it's brought up, we see Scout harboring her own prejudice about her neighbor, Boo Radley, which she's never met. Scout says, inside the Radley house lived a malevolent phantom, page 10. She also mentions rumors about Boo Radley and her fear of him. She believes the rumors enough to have a present fear of him, even though she's never seen him.
This shows how naive Scout is, but also how the community influences her, as Stephanie Crawford gives her gossip, and Scout participates in her brother's game to mock Boo Radley by reenacting Stephanie Crawford's tales. Listen to this page on page 52. It was a melancholy little drama, woven from bits and scraps of gossip and neighborhood legend. They used this game to manifest this crazy version of the man that is Arthur Radley, despite never interacting or knowing the man themselves.
And of course there's lots of racial prejudice. Scout herself sees one side of it and explains to her experience at the church of her African American cook, and how all the church seems to be the same as hers and how she didn't expect that. She says, Reverend Sykes then called on the Lord to bless the sick and suffering, a procedure no different from our own church practice, on page 161. She learns that African Americans aren't so different from everyone else.
So how is exposing children to prejudice a benefit of this book?
Well, it shows how harmful prejudice can be and how wrong they may be.
In the book, Scout witnesses a trial that is clouded with racial prejudice, and it is clear to everyone that the man being convicted isn't guilty. Let me explain. Tom Robinson is a black man who's accused of raping and beating a white woman. Atticus, Jem and Scout's father, is the lawyer who's appointed to defend him. Throughout the trial, Atticus proves that it couldn't have been Tom Robinson who beat the woman, as his left arm is crippled and it's her right side of her face that was beaten, meaning the attacker was left-handed or at least using his left hand. And that's only part of this case. And it's clear to even Atticus's children that Tom Robinson isn't guilty. Despite this, he's convicted, as Scout says in her narration on page 282, guilty, 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 guilty. I peeked at Jim. His hands were white from gripping the balcony rail, and his shoulders jerked as if each guilty was a separate stab between them. Scout sees her brother struggle with how Tom Robinson was so obviously not guilty, yet still convicted. Atticus explains how in court in Alabama in the 1930s, when it's a black man versus a white man, the white man is bound to win.
Not only is she seeing how prejudice can turn an innocent man guilty in the eyes of those with prejudice, she sees how prejudice can be wrong and how a seemingly mean old woman can have more courage than a man with a gun.
What do you mean?
At one point in the book, Scout and Jem go to read to their outspoken neighbor, Mrs. DeVos, and resent her for her rude comments about their father and how they behave. They learn after they finish their daily readings that a few days later, she dies. They also find out that Mrs. DuBose was struggling with the morphine addiction and that before she died, she fought and broke her addiction in her last living month during their readings. Atticus explains that Mrs. DuBose is more than just a mean old lady and that even though, as Atticus says, she had her own view about things a lot different from mine, maybe I wanted you to see what real courage is, instead of getting the idea that courage is a man with a gun in his hand, as stated in page 149. She teaches Scout and Jem how you can only judge so much without knowing the full story, and how not only is Mrs. DuBose more than just a mean old lady, her determination is worth more than a man with a gun in his hand. And just because there is a praise that comes from a good shot, there is more admiration in making an effort even when it seems pointless.
I understand what you're saying. I know from my time reading the book, I remember how wrong Scout was about Boo Radley and how the man they thought was a monster was a man who gave them gifts, kept them safe, and saved their lives.
Exactly.
I'm starting to see what you're saying. Why don't you tell me more about the evidence you collect and we can see what we can do in court? Alright, let's break down these characters and see if we have anything we want to add to this case.
Let's take a look at Atticus, Tom Robinson, and Scout.
This is a kind of teacher throughout the novel, and he tries to keep both Jem and Scout innocent and fights for others who are innocent, such as Tom Robinson. He tries to protect Tom Robinson and make a fight for the innocent while also remaining innocent himself. For example, he refuses to respond negatively when Mrs. DuBose insults him, when Mr. Cunningham and the mob threatens him outside the jail, and even when Bob Ewell threatens him.
So Atticus is a great fictional role model to keep in mind.
Alright, what about Tom Robinson?
Well, Tom Robinson works as the mockingbird of the story because, as Calpurnia explains, mockingbirds don't do one thing but make music for people to enjoy. That's why it's a sin to kill a mockingbird, as stated in page 119. This demonstrates how a mockingbird represents innocence, and as we find out that Tom Robinson is innocent, he never did much to hurt anyone, but he was still convicted and eventually killed. And it explicitly states in page 369, "There's a black boy dead for no reason, and the man responsible for it is dead." Here we see the sheriff's point of view of his innocence, and how Tom Robinson is clearly innocent, and how Bob Ewell, or the man responsible, is the one who's guilty. The idea of the mockingbird continues throughout the novel, progressing the idea of innocence.
And then there's Scout. She's quite naive, which makes her innocent when she explains that one night she sneaks out to go see Atticus at the jail, and there's a mob trying to get to Tom Robinson. Atticus tells Scout to go home, but she recognizes someone in the mob and tells him about his son without realizing that she's making his man regret his actions.
It's interesting how the author uses Scout as the narrator, because her naiveness of being a young child creates a new perspective. As a reader, we may understand more within context, but it's ultimately Scout's innocence that leads actions and events within the story. By banning this book, you were removing a teaching opportunity to begin to analyze and understand literature. There's so much that is not said that is just beneath the surface, that is easy for students to find, which creates a greater introduction to a higher understanding of literature.
Alright, this is where we leave you to make your case.
Issue on the table: To Remove or to Keep the Ban on To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee in the City of Riverdale. We will now begin.
Members of the jury, as we speak to you today, I want you to keep in mind that by banning this book, Riverdale isn't just banning another book off the shelf, but banning a learning opportunity to teach young children the dangers of prejudice and a higher understanding of literature, as well as a way to view past perspectives of the American people. As we present our cases today, I want you to keep in mind the context of the language used and what can be learned from the graphic experiences described in the novel.
Citizens of Riverdale, I ask you to look upon this case as not banishing a harmless piece of literature, but to see the book for its toxicity and how the horrible language and graphic descriptions of sexual content will taint the youth rather than inspire them with my opposition. So I ask you to think of your children and what you would want to share of the glory details of this novel.
Prosecution, can you present your evidence?
During the young ages of Harper Lee's life, her father worked as a lawyer on many civil rights cases. She grew up seeing certain people in trouble and said to depict this in her novel To Kill a Mockingbird, which had a big impact on the civil rights movement due to its themes of prejudice and racism. Prejudice is a recurring theme throughout the book, aimed at analyzing and criticizing how racism was prevalent at the time. However, even currently, efforts are being made to combat racism and spread awareness that it still exists today. In Philadelphia, April 12, 2018, two African-American men, Rashton Nelson and Dante Robinson, entered a local Starbucks and were wrongfully accused of trespassing due to racial bias. In an attempt to improve its corporate image, Starbucks issued a 4-hour training aimed at reducing biased perspectives. We can't ignore the real issues that occur, like reality being that in 2017, police killed 1,147 people, 25% being African American, making them 3 times likely to be killed than their Caucasian counterparts. If racism is so prevalent in this country, and whether or not you like it, your children are going to be exposed to it, isn't it better that they're exposed to it in an educational environment?
Defense?
Do you really think a book that includes foul and racial language and also mentions a case about a horrific rape should be read to our children?
Can we have the jury's decision?
Yes, Your Honor. We find that the book will remain banned.